So we want to talk for a few moments here and help you think through your sermon structure. So behind this is thinking about buildings and houses and any type of structure that we occupy, churches, buildings, and they have structure. They have walls, they have columns and pillars and beams and all the parts that belong to a building. And so just like a building has structure, your sermon needs to have structure as well. And so let's try to spend some time here looking at how this might look in your sermon. So every building has structure. Your sermon needs to have one, and we will arrive at that. So think about the skeleton of any type of animal. Your own body has a skeleton. And so therefore all creatures have skeletons, and then the sermon itself has the skeletons. We may not always communicate the parts of it, but we specifically might point to a bone, a ligament, and be able to explain that for a moment in time. So all expository preaching begins with the skeleton pieces, and you begin to explore the parts of there and how they relate to one another, how they fit the one structure of that particular passage. And so that's where we're heading over the next few slides. Expository preaching, looking again, you've seen this before in another lecture on Ramesh Richards' book, Preparing for an Expository Sermon. Think about your sermon as a bridge. You're building the one part of it, and then you're building the actual road that goes across to get to the other side. And a bridge has its foundation. And so just like your house has built on a foundation, or any type of building has a foundation, you're building on it. And so you begin with study, you move then to the structural components, looking at the exegetical side of the passage. You're moving toward the exegetical or central propositional statement. And then you're thinking about the three questions, applying it, proving it, and so on, in order to raise the brain level of the individual to consider they need to listen to what you have to say. And then you have that central propositional statement where it's really the big idea, as Haddon Robinson has coined it. Don Sanukian, same homiletical idea. Brian Chappell. Others are in the field of preaching are saying that there needs to be a central, and so in English we talk about the thesis statement. There needs to be a central thesis statement, idea statement that is clearly stated to the listener and that is repeated multiple times throughout the sermon so that there's clarity, and as you begin from the introduction all the way to then the final conclusion. So right now we're focusing on the homiletical outline, the clarity, the intro, and the conclusion. You know, your intro is much as important as the structural side of your sermon. All the hermeneutical and exegetical exegesis, all that you're doing in your study, your intro and your conclusion is also important to the structure of your sermon. So how should you structure your sermon? It's a good question that we'll field here for a moment, and we'll walk through it. So there are types of sermon structure. You think about your introduction, and then the body is the meat of your presentation, and then you have a conclusion. Sometimes our introduction is slow and doesn't have a good build, and it lacks contemporary expression. It might be off to the normal, usual pattern as we often do. Others, they start very bold and they build and they build and they build in order to show the body of the sermon in its 3 parts or 4 parts. And then finally, the conclusion. So one of the questions that comes often is, why do we have 3 points in a sermon? Why not 4? Why not 5? Well, think in 3 parts as equals to 10-minute time slots, as they're saying that a typical sermon lasts about 30 minutes in length, and so you walk through your points in that fashion. But back to the sermon structure, as we think about introduction, body, and conclusion, is similar to how we would write an essay. We have an introduction, we have the body of the content of the essay, and then we have the conclusion where we're wrapping our thoughts up and bringing our point home. One of the things that we need to think about in terms of sermon presentation, there are deductive type of sermons there are inductive type of sermons, and there are also inductive to deductive, and we'll walk through each one of these as on this PowerPoint. So deductive, you have a central propositional statement, and you state it up front, and then your body, when we think about deductive, we're moving from general statements then to specific, and we state our central propositional statement at the conclusion. The problem with a deductive methodology is you need to be listening on the front end and you need to be listening on the back end. And so those are some of the statements. In an inductive, where we start with the specific statements, we spend a lot of time on the specific application. We move from theme, and then we have our parts, our three-part, and then we restate the central propositional statement at the conclusion. What I like often, and I do recommend a balanced approach where you look at both inductive to deductive methodology. You state the theme up front, what you're going to discuss, and then you move through your points and you restate your central propositional statement after every point of your sermon. So in this case, you're seeing the 3-point outline strategy here. And after every point number 1, you state your central propositional statement. You may even have what we call a big question that you frame at the beginning of your sermon, and you restate that big question in point number 1 with the follow-up of your central propositional statement. Then you transition and you state number 2 there, and you follow up with the big question again with the central propositional statement or the big idea or the homiletical idea. Those are both the same terms throughout any given preaching book. They tend to say the same thing. And then you conclude with the central propositional statement. You might reinforce again that big question that you entered in with at the beginning of your introduction to your sermon. You conclude it, remind them what you have been discussing over the last 30 minutes, encouraging them this is their take-home point as they work through the sermon. So deductive starts narrow, and you see kind of like in an hourglass where it's widening out, right? And then becomes narrow again in the more inductive. So it starts big and then narrows down in the inductive methodology. Just know the difference, and you should evaluate your preaching to see which style you tend to go. Now, often what happens is when you think about the hourglass methodology for inductive to deductive, it's quite helpful to see that often right in the middle, and those are those transitional statements you make. Again, you're repeating that central propositional statement as you conclude. So what are some advantages? And well, number one, it's clear as you think through, you're working through the cycles. And then one of the other things with the inductive, you're keeping things very interesting and moving. You're moving the parts around. People are able to see clearly how point number 1 relates to point number 2, and so on. And then with inductive, it becomes more of a pattern for teaching, and people can see the parts of the sermon unfold, and you can move through those patterns to help them see the whole of that passage as you move through the parts. So which one should you use? Just know that all of them will be in play during your preaching moment or your preaching calendar. Some of you might be more deductive in your approach, and you may need to show some movement toward more of an inductive methodology. And so what we often say is preach for variety. Don't always stay with one discipline. See how you might get into other areas and change up your style just a little bit for the sake of your people that you're ministering to. So how long should your sermon outline be? That's a great question. I'll try to answer it on this slide. I would encourage you to keep your points as short as possible and also in style. Let me offer up another practical way to think about your sermon outline. Think of your outline like a table of contents page of a book. If you were to open up a textbook, a book that you're reading, and you go to the table of contents, what will you see? You'll see a very distinctive, short outline, succinct to the point. And I would say that that's a helpful way to think about your sermon outline. You want to be clear, you want to be concise, you want it to be to the point so that your people can also be, it can be memorable, it can be quickly written down, especially if some of our churches are not technologically inclined, whereas maybe you don't have PowerPoint that you're using along with your message. And this is just a quicker way of helping people listen to your message. Now, there are multiple ways to do your presentation, and it probably deserves its own lecture. But let me just say it here, that when you think about presenting your outline on Sunday, two different approaches. One, you have a fill-in-the-blank methodology, or you simply just provide the main points on the back of your bulletin. Here are your points that you're going to cover, and then you have space in between your points where people can fill in their own notes of what you are going to cover during those transitional moments. Totally fine. Either methodology is workable. You need to figure out what is the best style and approach that would make sense for your people. I often, currently in my context, I'm providing the outline points, the full outline points. There's no fill in the blank. I've done both. And people are able to follow you. They know exactly what you're going to cover even before you present. And it makes you accountable. I like that because you're able to say, these are my 4 points that I'm going to cover, and you do. And it holds you accountable to what you're going to cover for that time period of the message. Now, often they say 2 to 4 main points is fine. Whatever is going to work, but you need to stay within those boundaries. And of course, I have dealt with people that I have 8 points I'm going to cover. I remember David Platt one time presented, I think it was a 30-point outline. Well, that's David Platt. You're not David Platt. I'm not David Platt. And so we need to work within the context that God has assigned. So figure out your style, but also know that within homiletics, there is a certain skill set that we are trying to hone in on and refine and make sure that our preaching is clear and concise and gets to the point of what we're trying to cover. Now, how do I decide the sermon structure in the presentation? Well, let me say this, that I think as we think about the inductive process, it's the end result, but where is the main idea? Well, inductive, again, is at the end. Deductive is at the beginning. And then when we think about application, we're thinking about simple ones that we give at once. If it's cyclical, it's cycles. So we think in cycles and spots along the way that we're repeating. And so this is the way it goes. So from simple inductive to cyclical inductive process, and then the cyclical deductive process is how we work. So we work from the end. For inductive, deductive, we work from the beginning, and we work its way out. If you're more of a cyclical process, again, you're dividing your sermon into cycles, and you're moving the parts along as the listener is listening to your preaching. Now, when we think about simple inductive process, let's look at Acts chapter 6. Acts chapter 6 is about the widows who were neglected of the meal or the food distribution. The church was growing and multiplying, and they were having this dilemma, and they needed to solve that dilemma, and the apostles set forth the solution to the problem. Choose 7 men among you, full of the Spirit, a list of qualification, and this is how they would minister amongst the Hebraic Jews. So the church was growing. That's what we learned in chapter 6, verse 1. They had a food problem, and you can see that in some ways this is very inductive and also textual at the same time, going right to the heart of the passage. And as Don Sanukian suggests here, I'm looking at what the passage is saying and I'm taking it at face value. And then what's the result? Well, the result is they choose the 7 men, and then they become the leaders over this assigned ministry area. So what's the subject here? The subject is when church growth problems arise, how should we solve them? Okay, so it's a good beginning subject of the question. And let me try to point this out through a Roman numeral pointing. The apostles solved the growth problem with lay leadership. Now, here is the sermonic problem. The question that you need to think through is, do I say this, the apostles solved the growth problem with lay leadership as my first point, or do I transpose the structure here and say it in a contemporary way? Well, homiletic professors and scholars and those skilled in the art of preaching would say you could say the textual point, but you need to transpose it in your preaching simultaneously as you lead your people. So the church should solve church growth issues with, with critical leadership, or with committed leadership, is another way of saying it. Okay, so the church was growing. The church had a food problem, and they designated leaders to solve the problem. So your church is growing. Your church has a food problem. Really, it's a ministry problem, is another applicational point as you think about it. And they designated leaders to solve the problem. So the solution to the problems of a growing church is, the answer, lay leadership. How do we solve the problem? Well, we appoint people. We appoint those in the church, those who are credible, those who have good, strong leadership ability, and we assign them specific tasks that are associated with their gifts. And so we keep moving through the structure. We find the solution to our problems through appointing key leaders around the growing dilemma that we're facing. So what's the exegetical idea? There it is in point number 1. The apostles solved the growth issue, the growth problem. The church was growing, and you have this primary ministry need of widows, and therefore they assigned 7 men to wait the tables that the apostles said that they shouldn't be doing. They should be focusing on prayer and the teaching of the word. And so we move from the exegetical idea to the more inductive methodology. The main point of your sermon is flowing out this key exegetical point that you are making right at the get-go. So this is what we call the simple inductive approach to preaching. You come out of the gate, you state it specifically, and the people know exactly what you are saying from the beginning of your message. And of course, we can continue to point out what the exegetical problem. We state the point in number 1. We then show them in the text, particularly in verses 2 through 6, how the exegetical problem is re-emphasized again. And then we keep moving through our sermon. From a cyclical style, which is cycle-based, when should church growth problems arise? We should solve them with what type of process? Well, their church was growing, and so here is our inductive cyclical way. We move from inductive to a cycle preaching. The church, like ours, was growing, and so here is how we might address this area of ministry concern. And so we point it to the example. So their church was growing, we're growing. And so then you give some application. How is our church growing? Or where might this problem arise? How might we handle it as we move through the future? But growing churches have problems, all of our, and sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad. And so there needs to be structure, of course, in place. And we move through the cycle of preaching. The solution then is the finality. Again, you'll see it kind of broken up. And so you state what the main problem is in the text, and then you follow up with the applicational point. They had problems, we have problems, they solved their problems, we need to solve our problems as presented in this particular biblical text. I hope that helps clear up some of the ambiguity, the difference between inductive, deductive, cyclical style of preaching, and maybe a helpful way to examine your own personal preaching methodology. So here's a simple deductive way of thinking through. When church growth problems arise, we should solve them with lay leadership. So we're stating the main problem right at the beginning there. The solution to Jerusalem's growth problem was lay leadership. Notice the more exegetical style, we're just kind of staying what the text is saying and not transposing it. But notice what A is. Jerusalem church grew. They had a food problem and they designated leaders. So again, I'm showing the textual side of the preaching moment. The solution to our group problem, so we move from textual then to the applicational. The solution to our group problem is that we too need to appoint leaders to the ministry task. Because notice I'm going to emphasize that main idea as the center part. So I move from text to my main point, my applicational point, and I begin to apply this now contextually to the work that I'm doing here at my church. Well, we're growing. We have our problems. And what is our need? Well, we need to assign people to this ministry problem area. And once we do this, we're going to be able to solve it. So you get to see the flow of how this is built. Now the question is, it's going to come back here in a little bit. Which style am I looking for in this upcoming sermon that you'll present? You'll find that I don't tell you, and that's a good thing. But one thing you can do is think about your style and go with a different style. Use this time to stretch your methodology that you normally, Dr. Badal, I normally start with a deductive methodology, and I need to grow in my inductive method. And if that's the case, that's the way you need to go. And I would encourage that for your upcoming preaching sermon. So notice some more here of thinking through the points of an outline and how number 1 to number 2 are connected, A and A, B and B, and you'll begin to see how you can do your outlining points for your theological sermon. Notice C is connecting down to C in the second point. So again, where is the application? Well, cyclical is throughout. You're telling stories and principles. Think cycles. Think cycles. Cycle 1, cycle 2, and then cycle 3. And then as you think about deductive versus inductive approach to the main idea of your sermon. Now, one of the things you need to consider is moving from the history, the historical time period of the passage, to the timeless truth in which your people are living. So you're living in a contemporary society. How do you take something that was old from 2,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, and apply it to your contemporary audience in which you're living? It's a great question. So let me help you move through this some more. Develop the passage outline. That's your first strategy. Your passage outline is going to be very exegetical, nuts and bolts. This is what the passage is about. This is the author. These are the key ideas. Then transpose that passage outline, what happened long ago, to what we call a truth outline. This is what is going to take shape on Sunday morning, but it still has some more metamorphosis that's going to be taking place over time, because you move from truth outline to timeless truth that you're going to present on Sunday morning to your people. That's going to be critical. It's going to take on different forms. It's going to get, the iterations are going to change. You might start Monday with these thoughts, and all of a sudden by Friday, it's taking shape. And depending on the size and structure of your church, you might have a due date by Thursday. Things need to be turned in because bulletins need to be produced. PowerPoints have to be produced by your audio and technology department at your church. And so they're wanting these things to be finalized. And so you're going to have to work through that preaching calendar schedule and how things shape and get done. But this is where you want to move toward the structural side of your preaching. Let's look at our Bibles to Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 20. This is the matter of church discipline and what was going on. Jesus approaches this subject, and how do we handle a sinning brother who has been found guilty of sin? Well, in verses 15 through 17, we have the manner in which the church should correct and restore a sinning Christian is by keeping the matter as private as possible. While this is a healthy bullet number 1 point, it's very difficult for someone to remember the memorable moment of exactly how we should handle church discipline. Well, let me explain this some more. So think through the exegetical nature of your outline. So here's the second component of church discipline. The reason the church can restore or excommunicate an errant believer is because it acts as the extension of the authority of God himself. By these 2 points alone, while they're biblical and exegetically sound, they're not memorable enough, and so you'll have to do the tweaks along the way this week to bring it into a more of a memorable, short, table of content driven type of sermon. And so here's the fancy exegetical idea. The reason the church should restore a sinning Christian correctly is because this restoration is carried out as an extension of God's authority. Well, you know, that's going to take on some converting from the exegetical outline to the homiletical outline, or the fancy contemporary outline that you're going to perform on Sunday. So you move from passage outline to your sermon outline. Your sermon outline is the presentation that is going to take shape for Sunday. It's how you're going to present. It's the structure. It's your transitional points. It also incorporates your illustrations and your applications. So the exegetical idea, the reason the church should restore a sinning Christian correctly is because it's the extension of God's authority. Well, let me try to build this some more. As you've seen on the previous slide, the manner in which the church should correctly restore a sinning Christian is by keeping the matter as private as possible. It said that really sounds good, it's biblical, it's structurally sound, however, it's not memorable. And then that would be the same for point number 2 as we brought it over from the previous slide. So let's try to structurally work through this and move it toward the sermon outline. How do we restore sinning Christians properly? It's a good big question as we introduce the topic to our people. Well, God's way to restore believers in sin is to keep the matter as private as possible. Notice the difference in the structural style of that presentation. A lot of words have already been chopped out. You might even say, as you're looking at this sermon outline, this question, can I chop more out so that when I say it, it's clear, it's concise, and it's to the point, and someone can write down the point if they need to. And that's where the restructuring of your sermon outline needs to take shape. Why can we restore or excommunicate a member? And so that moves us into our second statement. Our church is the extension, it extends the authority of God himself. And this is why we can execute church discipline in the life of the assembly. And we must do this. Why? We must do it and remember that we are an extension of God's authority here on earth. And so we exercise church discipline on behalf of the Lord, and we help move people along in the reconciliation process as well. So we move from passage outline to sermon outline. We tweak our exegetical outline into our final sermonic outline in order for the people who are hearing it. It takes on a more principle approach, contemporary approach that they're able to relate to. So the first question today, verses 5 through 17, is how do we restore sinning Christians properly? It's probably not a good beginning, but rather you transition the big question maybe through some type of beginning illustration to state the opening up of your introduction about this very delicate, very important topic in the life of the church. But you need to frame it in such a way that the people are going to stay with you as you work through it. Well, God's way to restore believers in sin is to keep the matter as private as possible. The point of verses 18 and 20, the church acts as an extension of the authority of God himself. Well, what is the principle that we want to share here, or at least tell our people? is this. The main idea is that we must restore sinning members properly because it acts as on God's behalf. We act on God's behalf, and we are an extension of that. And begin to apply that even more. And that main point is repeated in cycle preaching. So if you're going with a cyclical approach, you're going to say the main idea after each main point that you make, 1, 2, and 3. And again, in the difference between inductive and deductive, you shape your points differently, your main points differently from the beginning and from the end. I hope that clearly states. You may want to go back and repeat the video for review and touch on some of the weak areas that is in your preaching and your methodology. None of us have arrived in preaching. We all need to get better at it. We need to sharpen our skills some more. It's like an axe going to the grinder. We want this to be sharpened in our life. So no one has arrived in preaching. We're a work in progress, and this is why we study the art of preaching and have classes on it to help and sharpen your skill set. And so that is the intention of this week's module, and also in the weeks to come, to sharpen your skill and to offer up some more tools along the way that will encourage you and also help you in your preaching moment and also your ministry at your local church. May God bless you.